Scott Hall is one of the rare performers who is, in many ways, the total package. He's an excellent in-ring worker with great promo skills, tons of charisma, and a fantastic physique to boot. With all of that going in his favor then, there really should have been nothing stopping him from reaching the top of the wrestling world. And while in some ways he did just that, becoming a key factor in one of the most game-changing angles in the industry's history, his personal demons certainly had a firm hold of him, stopping him from going even further than he did. Still, that's not to say he hasn't achieved more than most other performers could dream of in their lifetime. So join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey in Razor's Edge, the Scott Hall story. Scott Oliver Hall was born on October 20th, 1958 in St. Mary's County, Maryland, though as the son of a military man, he would find himself moving to a new place at least once a year up until the age of 15. This obviously then made it hard for him to lay down any roots, and though he was always a fan of wrestling as a youngster, he wouldn't find a career in this world immediately upon leaving school because he would first drift from job to job for a while, primarily working as a security guard at bars and nightclubs. And it was at a nightclub where he was working in Orlando in 1983 that Hall had an altercation with a patron which ended with him shooting the man in self-defense, accidentally killing him. At the time, he was even charged with second-degree murder. However, these charges would later be dropped given the circumstances of the event. Still though, even though he wasn't guilty of murder, it would be an incident that weighed heavy on his mind for the rest of his life, and is what many people, including his best friend Kevin Nash, believed to be the trigger point for his later drug and alcohol problems. But those problems wouldn't take over his life yet, because by 1984, he had finally gotten a foot in the door of the wrestling world after deciding to change careers following the shooting. His first job in the industry would come then via Championship Wrestling from Florida, who, seeing the potential the youngster had, booked him into a feud with Dusty Rhodes. From there, Hall would bounce around the territory system, working as a part of a tag team with Dan Spivey and gaining experience everywhere he went while he stopped by the likes of Jim Crockett Promotions in North Carolina and Midwest Wrestling Association in Missouri. His first real big break as a singles performer wouldn't come until 1985 though, when he joined Vern Gagne's American Wrestling Association, one of the top promotions in the country at that point. Here, he spent the next 4 years working as Magnum Scott Hall, a babyface superstar named as such because of his similarity to Magnum PI star Tom Selleck. In fact, so much did Gagne see in Hall at this time that it's been rumored he believed he could be his next Hulk Hogan, even going as far as to instruct him to use moves and mannerisms similar to Hogan during his matches. And Hall did find success with this, initially while part of a team with Kurt Hennig, and then later as a solo act that would go on to challenge the likes of Stan Hansen and Rick Martel for the AWA World title. That said, for all the success he was finding, he was smart enough to recognize that by 1989, mismanagement and dwindling fan interest meant that the AWA was sinking fast, and that if he wanted to survive, he would have to jump ship to somewhere else. And so the next few years would see Scott try his luck at a number of other promotions, spending 6 months at World Championship Wrestling later that year before having brief stints with the likes of New Japan Pro Wrestling in the East, Catch Wrestling Association in Germany, World Wrestling Council in Puerto Rico, and even a tryout for WWE, before finally returning to Ted Turner's Atlanta-based promotion where he would spend his 1991 and 1992. This period saw him rechristened as the Diamond Stud, a Rick Rude-esque character who was managed by Diamond Dallas Page, and with his help, he was able to pummel his way through a number of mid-card talents such as Tommy Rich and Tom Zink. Following that, he also briefly teamed with his future Click cohort Kevin Nash, then going by Vinny Vegas, but despite this, by May of 1992, Hall had decided to leave the company after being offered the opportunity of a lifetime to work for WWE. And so, later that month, he would make his debut for Vince McMahon's promotion as Razor Ramon, a Tony Montana-inspired gimmick that was reportedly suggested by Hall himself after having watched Scarface. Yes, one thing that everyone has been able to agree on over the years is that the Maryland native has one of the best minds in the business when it comes to creating characters, and this character would turn out to be an absolute hit from day one as the bad guy, as he referred to himself, would put on his best Pacino impression while mowing through WWE's undercard talent and making himself look like a killer in the process. And while he was certainly supposed to be a bad guy, his cool demeanor drew more than a few cheers from fans, making him one of the early examples of a cool heel in the process. Despite this, however, his first major feud saw him paired up against firm fan favorite Macho Man Randy Savage after Hall had cost Savage a match against Ric Flair on the September 14th episode of Primetime Wrestling. This even led to a tag team match featuring Razor and Flair taking on Savage and Mr. Perfect at that year's Survivor Series, which helped to put the newcomer on the map. And with the success of that program, Vince McMahon next decided to push the bad guy into the main event picture as he challenged Bret Hitman Hart for the WWE title at the 1993 Royal Rumble, a match that, while he would lose, would prove to fans that he could hang at the top of the card. Following this, the growing cheers for Ramon were becoming too much to ignore, and so the company decided to turn him babyface that summer after he had started a program with the 1-2-3 Kid, a feud which gave fans one of the most iconic moments of Raw's early days when the, at the time, jobber 1-2-3 Kid scored a shock pinfall victory over the Razor, setting him on the path to stardom. And it was this victory that was the storyline reason for the bad guy turning face, with his newfound respect for his opponent from there blossoming into a tag team. Of course, Hall and Kid, real name Sean Waltman, would become close friends backstage too, eventually forming part of a unit that also included Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, and Triple H, and would be known as the Clique, a group that wielded so much collective power and influence backstage over the next couple of years that at times many believed they were the ones really pulling the strings. But that's not to say Razor wasn't talented as hell on his own merits though, so on October 11th of 1993 when he beat former AWA cohort Rick Martel to become the Intercontinental Champion for the first time, it was hard to argue that he didn't deserve it. And with his first singles title win now under his belt, he then segued into a feud with Shawn Michaels over who was the real Intercontinental Champion. Now the reason for this dispute was due to Michaels having had to vacate the belt months before after being suspended. When he returned, he argued that no one had ever beaten him and that because of this, the title should still be his. The match that came out of this would be the now iconic WrestleMania 10 ladder match, the first ladder match ever done on WWE pay-per-view, and the first one that most fans had ever seen. Of course, every wrestling fan has seen 1001 ladder matches by this point, but that first one remains special for most because of what those two men were able to do that night, absolutely stealing the show in a classic that would set the template for every bout like it in the future. And so, with the groundbreaking success of that encounter, and a victory over HBK that proved him as the now undisputed champion, Razor moved on to a feud with his other Clique friend Kevin Nash for the remainder of that year. After that, he continued to build his portfolio of excellent matches against the likes of Jeff Jarrett before coming back around to the start again as he and Michaels had their much-anticipated ladder match rematch at SummerSlam 1995, with Michaels this time being the one to get the win. And despite the success of this match, frustrations were starting to build for the bad guy as he felt like he had hit a ceiling in the company's upper mid-card and was unable to progress any further. This was made even worse by the fact that he was seeing his friends Nash and Michaels ascend to world champion level, leaving him wondering what else he could do to get to that point. Reportedly, he even went to Vince McMahon around this time and flat out asked him how he could improve his stock in the company, only to be told that the position he was in was where the boss saw him remaining long term. This was the initial spark that saw him get in contact with Eric Bischoff over at WCW, who was keen to poach away as many big names from WWE as he could. And in early 1996, Hall, along with Kevin Nash, who was also frustrated with his low payouts at the time, both handed their notice to the company. After that, they would say their public goodbyes to their Clique teammates at the now infamous curtain call a couple of months later, a controversial moment we've discussed in more detail over on our Triple H and Kevin Nash videos. What would come next, though, would truly change the wrestling world forever, as on the May 27, 1996 episode of Nitro, Hall came out of the crowd in street clothes and entered the ring to cut a promo on WCW, telling them that he and his friends were there to take over. A couple of weeks later, and he was joined by Nash, who reiterated his buddy's intention. The implication was clear, of course. The two men had come over from WWE to invade the competition, and though in truth both were no longer working for Vince McMahon by that point, fans bought into the whole thing regardless, as the Outsiders, as they were dubbed, became the hottest thing in the industry in the weeks that followed. And things would only get hotter from there, as at July 7th's Bash at the Beach pay-per-view, they would be joined by a third man in the form of Hulk Hogan, who subsequently turned heel for the first time since he had become a star and labeled the three men the New World Order, there to take over the whole industry and rebuild it in their image. Now, if you weren't watching wrestling at this time, it's impossible to overestimate how cool this whole storyline was. Fans in North America and Europe had never seen anything like it, in fact, and with its emphasis on realism, the company was even able to convince some people that these takeover attempts were legitimate, as at points, local police even got called to the show after the NWO attacked other performers backstage. And it's been made clear in the years since that Scott Hall was one of the key creative influences on this angle, once again showing his great mind for the business. But it wouldn't just be himself he was coming up with good ideas for at this time. No, he was also allegedly responsible for creating the NWO's chief rival in the form of Sting, who soon after would go through his own gimmick change, morphing into a character based on Brandon Lee's character in The Crow at the suggestion of Hall. Before that showdown would come, however, the NWO would continue to grow, adding further members such as Hall and Nash's old friend Sean Waltman, then going by the name of Six. And with this ever-swelling army behind them, the Outsiders went on to have huge success in the company's tag team division, winning the tag team titles on no less than 6 occasions over the next few years, all while putting on great matches against the likes of Harlem Heat, the Steiner Brothers, and the Four Horsemen. Sadly, though, it was also at this time that Hall's drug and alcohol issues began to spiral out of control. Sure, he had been a regular user during his time with WWE, but now, without the watchful eye of Vince McMahon keeping him in check, his dependency grew until it even became apparent to those watching on TV. By March of 1998, he was even removed from television and forced to enter rehab as the company tried to get him cleaned up, but it would ultimately be to no avail. And when he later returned to Nitro, he looked just as bad as ever, with fans now becoming increasingly concerned for him. By 1999, in fact, he had almost become a ghost on WCW TV, rarely appearing at all, and when he did, always looking worse for wear. The company even tastelessly tried to turn the whole thing into an angle at one point, changing his gimmick to Last Call Scott Hall and having him come out to the ring with a drink in hand. But by February 2000, even WCW had had enough, and after being pinned by Sid at Super Brawl 10, the bad guy disappeared from the company, never to return. Instead, he tried to make a living by showing up for brief runs in the likes of Extreme Championship Wrestling in New Japan, though these were met with little success as it was clear he was usually in no condition to perform. What a saving grace it seemed for his career then when in 2002, WWE, who had purchased the remains of WCW the year prior, decided to bring in the NWO for another Invasion storyline, this time seeing the original trio of Hall, Nash, and Hogan show up at February's No Way Out pay-per-view to cost Stone Cold Steve Austin a world title match against Chris Jericho. This would eventually lead to a program between Hall and Austin that could have been awesome had it happened a few years earlier, but by that point it was pretty much dead on arrival given the bad guy's condition. Nevertheless, it all climaxed in an underwhelming singles match between the two at WrestleMania 18, one which has become most memorable in the years since for Hall's selling of the Stone Cold Stunner towards the end. After that, the NWO were left in disarray when Hulk Hogan turned babyface and quit the group. This caused the Outsiders to try and bounce back by recruiting their fellow Clique member Sean Waltman once again, but the angle wouldn't last much longer after that, and by the summer, it would be dropped from TV entirely. Sadly though, Scott didn't even manage to last this long, as he would be fired on May 7th following his actions in the now infamous Plane Ride from Hell, which saw him reportedly get completely out of control and, along with a number of other wrestlers, cause havoc on a plane coming back from a show in England. And so now, out of a job once again, he scoped out his other options before eventually settling on TNA, making a few appearances at some of their early shows in 2002, and then coming back for more in 2004 and 2005. And while he wasn't working regularly during these years, he was at least trying to get his life back under control. Yes, there were multiple attempts by Hall to get clean at this time, and while none of them would stick for long, he threw himself back into the ring, returning to TNA on the November 1st, 2007 episode of Impact as he reunited with Kevin Nash to take on the Angle Alliance. Following that, he was even asked to come back for some more appearances, but ended up no-showing, damaging his relationship with the company so much that he wouldn't be seen again until January 2010 when he reappeared to form the band with Nash and Waltman, a clear play on their days as both members of the Clique and the NWO. After that, despite the kayfabe attempts of Hulk Hogan to remove Hall and Waltman from TNA, the band continued to cause chaos as they assaulted various members of the roster in the weeks that followed. This led to the Outsiders teaming again on the May 13th episode of Impact to win the TNA World Tag Team Championships, titles they would hold up until June 14th of that year before being stripped of them following Hall's release from the company. Yes, unsurprisingly, the bad guy's personal demons were once again the issue here. This time, however, he was acutely aware that he needed to try and get some help, so he reached out to WWE, who had an ongoing policy of paying for rehab for any of their past employees. And it was during this stint in rehab that, after going through a bout of double pneumonia, he discovered he was suffering from epilepsy, likely brought on by his years of drinking, something which would require him to take a cocktail of daily medications from then on in. And as if that wasn't bad enough, he was also fitted with a pacemaker around this time, meaning he would have to take extra care of himself in the future, or risk facing the ultimate price. Unfortunately though, as is the case with many addicts, he couldn't stay clean for long, and would regularly find himself relapsing in the years that followed. In April 2011, he was even hospitalized after having cardiac issues as a result of an overdose. Thankfully then, in 2013, he received a lifeline when his old friend Diamond Dallas Page reached out to him, offering him a shot at rebuilding his life. Now, in the years prior, Page had become known amongst the wrestling community as something of a modern-day saint, as he devoted his time to helping Jake the Snake Roberts return from the brink of death and successfully get his life back together. Of course, Hall knew about this, and so when he was given a chance to go stay with DDP at his Atlanta home and clean himself up, he jumped at it. A few months later, and the difference was already beginning to show for the former Intercontinental Champion, who was, by then, looking and feeling better than he had in decades. Yes, with the help of therapy, detoxing, and his patented DDP yoga, Page had managed to basically save Scott Hall's life. He was also able to raise almost $110,000 in funds to pay for a hip replacement surgery and dental work for his friend, procedures which the bad guy would undergo soon thereafter. And so now, sober and in good shape both physically and mentally for the first time in a long time, Hall re-entered the world and was met with an overwhelming wave of support from both wrestling fans and industry friends. He was even announced as an inductee in the 2014 WWE Hall of Fame, being put in under his old gimmick of Razor Ramon, and on April 5th of that year, he got his moment while being joined on stage by the rest of the clique as they all celebrated his career and life. Since then, bar a few setbacks, he's managed to remain sober and, by all accounts, is a new man, one who appears happy with the legacy he left behind in the ring, while also being able to watch it be carried on via his son Cody, who in recent years has become a prominent figure in New Japan Pro Wrestling and Pro Wrestling Noah. That's not to say he's disappeared from the spotlight entirely, though. No, he can always be counted on to make the odd cameo appearance at a WWE event, usually alongside either his former clique or NWO stablemates. Aside from being a consistently excellent in-ring worker when he could remain sober for long enough to perform, he's truly one of the best minds out there in wrestling, having come up with some of the most iconic characters of his era and playing a large part in the development of the NWO. And as the initial spark that began the NWO storyline that night in Georgia in 1996, he'll go down in history forever as creating one of the most iconic moments the industry has ever seen, one which the effects of are still being felt today. Who knows where wrestling would be today if he hadn't hit the ring to call out Billionaire Ted and the Nacho Man? It would likely look very different, so we can all thank Scott Hall for bringing the attitude back into wrestling when it was most sorely needed, and hope that now that he's gotten clean, he can finally enjoy the fruits of his hard work and his influence, because if anyone deserves it, it's him. Well guys, what did you think of the video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, as well as follow Wrestle with Andy on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.